So again, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 32nd IEEE Agricultural Robotics and Automation Technical Committee webinar. Today, we are honored to have a talk by Dr. and Professor Carrick Detweiler from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln here in the United States. Carrick is an assistant professor there in Nebraska, and he's going to talk today about bringing aerial robots closer to crops, sensing, sampling, and safety. As all of you know, unmanned aerial vehicles are literally, and no pun intended, they are taking off very rapidly in many applications. Here in the U.S., there have been more than 2,000 applications approved by the Federal Aviation Administration. And one of the applications that's drawing a lot of interest is agriculture. There are lots of challenges related to using unmanned aerial vehicles to collect data and how to use that data for precision agriculture. And more than that, how to fly close to the crops, how to ensure the safety of the aircraft, the crop, the people, and going beyond that, how to use those vehicles to do manipulation tasks such as collecting water samples and even recharging remotely deployed sensors. And that's all part of the work that Carrick and his group are doing in Nebraska. And again, it's an honor to have them today come and share that story with us. Carrick is an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln at the Computer Science and Engineering Department. He comes from the MIT famous CSAO lab, the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence lab. Carrick, he is as a young faculty, but already received important awards and has received funding from both the NSF and USDA. In particular, the prestigious National Robotics Initiative grant to further his work in agricultural robotics. So with that, let me ask you guys just once more, please go to the Join Me app, click on the person icon, change where it says viewer to your name, so we know who are the colleagues who are joining every month. And I'm happy to inform that just doing the introduction, we've jumped to 26 participants today, which is a fantastic number, among the highest we've had in the recent time. So Carrick, it's looking like there's a lot of interest from people all over the world. So with that, I'm going to ask people just once more to mute their phone or mic and use the magic of Join Me to give Carrick the presentation rights. Carrick, you there? Maybe you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, great. So, and let me just get this started, hopefully. Okay, and are my slides showing properly now? Okay, so can you hear me and see my slides? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you and see those slides in full screen.
Okay, great, thank you. So thanks for the great introduction. So as I said, my name is Carrick Detweiler, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And what I want to talk about today is really how some of the projects we're doing in my lab, the Nimbus lab, related to UAVs, aerial robots, and really the first part of my talk will be focused on agriculture, and then I'll get into a project on water quality that we've also been working on that's also related to kind of the water side of agriculture. But first, what I really wanted to do is start out by asking, what are UAVs used for? And And a lot of people, now the perceptions are changing, but still a lot of people think about, these types of big drones dropping bombs in Afghanistan. Um, but of course, what we're going to be talking about is much more, these types of drones. So the drones that we're using in agriculture, um, and we're seeing a proliferation of these types of vehicles. And a lot of what's happening with these types of vehicles is, as this kind of video shows, is they're really good at flying high, collecting images, using remote sensing techniques to basically observe different locations. So you saw a video of the Platte River, which is a big river in Nebraska, and this is the salt marsh area, also in Nebraska. That has a lot of kind of interesting characteristics. A couple of endangered species live here. But while these aerial images, you can get a lot out of them, what my research is mostly focused on is really kind of these low flying. So what can you do when you, instead of flying high, start flying low? And in part, there are a lot of challenges in robotics and how do you get really close. But you can also see, so this is that same salt marsh, but now when you get really close, you can see that there are these little, bubbles in the ground where there are little, animals and other types of processes going on. So I think there's a lot of advantages to getting close into the environment. And of course, if you get close, my hope is that, maybe we'll be able to do other interesting things like collect samples. And so what I'm going to talk about today is really some of the, how do you get closer into the environment and interact with the environment. And I think a lot of this is that when you're close to the environment, you really need to improve the autonomy of the vehicle. So GPS is great when you're flying high. You can program great paths. And this is what's happening now and really starting to revolutionize remote sensing for agriculture. But I think that the next generation of systems will really be about getting closer. And we really need to improve the autonomy, but also the reliability and safety of these systems. So I guess as was mentioned, this is definitely, I want this to be an informal talk. So if anybody has questions, feel free to type them in the chat window or unmute your microphone and ask so that we can. I'd love interactions in the talk as well. So what I'm gonna mainly talk about today are this kind of crop height estimation and row following work that we've been doing here at UNL. But then depending on how time is going, I'll talk about some other projects in the lab, including some of this aerial water sampling, how we are working to improve the safety of all these kind of robot systems interacting with the environment, and also a kind of wireless power transfer project that we're developing to basically be able to charge sensors that are in remote fields or other locations. So really the motivation that is driving this work is more on the kind of smaller scale phenotyping trials, where basically we're collaborating with a number of agronomists here at UNL and elsewhere who are doing phenotyping. So they're planting many genetic varieties of plants, and they want to really, improve their understanding of how water and nitrogen stress impact the different varieties of plants. And we're, again, interested in, what new types of things can we do when we start to fly close to the environment. And one of the things that we're looking at is using active sensors. So instead of, for instance, just passively measuring how the light is reflected off of the plants, perhaps you can fly at night really low with, actively emitting known wavelengths and use those to better measure the health and status of the crops. And the other thing that we're looking at, and that I'll start out by talking about, is actually crop height. So it turns out that crop height, even early in growing, is a good indicator of what the final yield will be. And mainly the work that I've been doing is on maize, so corn, which is one of the primary agricultural products in Nebraska. But crop height for corn and other plants can also, be a good indicator of stress and plant health. This is one of the things that's almost never collected regularly in these phenotyping trials. they will, as you see in this picture, at the end of growing, they'll end up, manually going out in the field and measuring the height of all these plants to see how the different phenotypes ended up growing. But it's almost never done commercially, and it's really never, you never see this done weekly because it's, even in research settings, because it's such a labor-intensive process. So this is one of the first things that we've been working on automating. And our approach is to use a small UAV, small drone, that is equipped with a laser scanner flying very close to the crops. So as you can see in this picture, we're going to fly just as close as we can to the crops because we have this laser scanner that's basically going to, in a single plane, measure the ranges to both the ground, but also to all the plants. And as you see in this this image, basically, you rarely will see the ground, and you'll see lots of leaves and other features of the plants, but occasionally you see the ground, and we want to fly close again because given the resolution of our laser scanner, the closer you fly, the more likely you'll basically be able to see points on the ground, and our goal is really to use this to extract crop height. And of course, the challenges are that we're flying close, we have very noisy data. It's these are all nicely planted in rows, and we'll leverage that. It's still a pretty unstructured environment, and we need to really make sure that we can actively control it because it's really hard to go out and fly really close to the tops of these crops. You basically can't do it manually for more than maybe a few tens of meters before you crash into it. So just a few more details on the system. The system we're using is this Ascending Technologies Firefly, which is a hex rotor UAV. It has about a 600 gram payload, and we're using a Hokoyu laser scanner that gives us data at 36 hertz and has a relatively short range, so 5.6 meters. And this is one of the less expensive laser scanners built, high quality, because basically with this we can get good data, and we can fly. And since we're flying close, we don't need a long range scanner. We also have.
Eric, allow me to interrupt you for just 1 second. Someone did not mute your phone, and it's disturbing the call. Everybody, please mute your phone right now. This is very important. It's very disturbing when other people are disturbing our speaker. Thank you. Carry on.
Yep. Yeah, so we also have onboard processing. So we're doing all of the data collection and analysis online. We also have a camera on board that we're using to collect data, although we're not using it in the actual control that I'll be talking about. But just to give you an idea of kind of what this data looks like. So this is an example of a laser scan basically flying over the crops. So the kind of yellow and more blue points you see, those are actually, and I can just pause this video. So those points are the points that are closer to the vehicle. And one thing, so this is pretty noisy. You can see that as you kind of go out, so I guess top or bottom of the screen, but kind of laterally from the vehicle, you get fewer basically sensor readings because some of them are blocked. You're just seeing less there. And from this type of data, our goal is really to extract the crop height. Now I won't go into kind of the mathematical details, but I want to just give you kind of an overview of how we do this. So we have these noisy scans. We also have information from the inertial measurement unit of the vehicle, because as you might imagine, as the vehicle is kind of pushed around, both as we're flying it, but also as winds come along, the pitch and roll are going to change basically how our laser, that's kind of point mounted in this downward looking configuration, will be read. So one of the first steps is just to do the transformation of the coordinate frames. And then what we're doing is basically we have a number of filters to basically reject outliers. And we found that just using kind of median filters works well, because we do get some kind of strong outliers, but for the most part, the kind of middle section of the data works well. We're then fusing this with a Kalman filter and doing a kind of a bunch of other things, and we basically end up having two processes where we're estimating where we see the bottoms of the crops and where we see the tops of the crops. And we can use that then just basically taking the difference between those to estimate the crop heights. Now, I can show you a kind of brief video of this flying. So this is, hopefully this video is showing up okay for you all, but basically this is us controlling the X and Y coordinate, but automated height control. So just flying back and forth over the crops. And we've done a number of these tests, and we've found this to be quite effective, both at autonomous height control and also being able to extract the height of the crops. So we did an experiment where we collected data with our approach. We also went out and manually had our agronomist colleagues measuring the height of the crops with their big meter stick that they normally use, and we came within 3 centimeters of the manual measurements. And basically, we think, we're within what we think is the error of the manual measurement. So with the system, we're able to quite quickly collect the crop height information, and we can also, we're flying with autonomous height control. So we're using the data that we get. Really, we're only seeing the ground. Typically, maybe 3 to 5% of the laser scans hit the ground, but that's enough. We can filter all this data using kind of the flow diagram I showed before to measure the height using this. Now, again, feel free to ask questions if you have questions. But one of the challenges is that what we got this working fairly well, flying good height control. But one of the first things we discovered, which is not particularly unexpected, but was that we really, while we can do good height control, GPS is not sufficient to actually be able to follow the rows with the precision we need. So now I want to talk a little bit about some relatively recent work we've done in actually automating the row following, again using the laser scanner. And the reason we need to do this is because most of these phenotyping trials, they'll basically plant a couple, typically 2, maybe 3 rows of the same genetic variety next to each other, and there'll be maybe a 10-meter long row of those, and then they'll switch to the next genetic variety. And so basically they have these very small number of plants for each one, relatively speaking. So we can't just kind of fly down this and collect the height, because we won't know which row it's from with kind of GPS accuracy. Of course, there are other options like using RTK GPS. There are some now, some companies are starting to develop these very lightweight receivers for RTK that are small enough to fly in a UAV. But talking with kind of our collaborators here, they're going to different sites. They don't want to necessarily set up a new base station at each site. They don't integrate. The current systems don't. The small lightweight systems don't integrate with the existing RTK systems that they have for the tractors. So basically, we're trying to get away from having to do some of this setup and adding payload to it. So what we've been doing is actually using the data from the laser scanner again to estimate where, basically to be able to follow the rows. So Again, I'm not going to go into the kind of mathematical details of it, but let me try to give you a kind of hopefully an intuitive idea of how we're doing this. And the way we're doing this is really we are leveraging the idea that we know how closely the rows are planted. So they're planted, at a precise distance apart. So if you look at the top right image here, this is kind of what a raw laser scan looks like. But if we can exploit some of the kind of the known geometry, so on the left you can see the corn plants, and basically one of the first steps that we do is we basically say, okay, we expect the plants to be a certain distance apart, and then we can do kind of a sliding window approach where we test different hypotheses, which bins, whether it's the yellow, the red, or the blue, contain the actual plants. And so then in this bottom left plot, you can see after doing this process and testing it, we can filter out a lot of the data. So in that bottom left plot, we can see these are the points that remain that had the kind of in terms of this kind of voting scheme, the most likely points to correspond to the stocks. And we have to do, again, a fair amount of other filtering to be able to say, okay, this is the actually kind of the center of the plant versus just the leaf. There's a lot of challenges that you can think about when, for instance, you may be, if you're close to a leaf that's kind of bent down, you'll only see the leaf and nothing else. So we're doing a lot of processing here. But ultimately, what we then do is, so this picture on the bottom left is 3 rows, and if you then merge those points by the row offset, and that's shown kind of by these blue points on the right-hand plot, that basically shifting by the row offset, we can then get an estimate of where we are relative to the row, and use that for actually our location estimate. And so this is here are some kind of showing results. So we actually, the kind of last of the corn in our test plot here was harvested about a week ago. So we've been doing a lot of flying and data collection up until just about a week ago. So we have to actually get ground truth estimates, but the plot on the right shows basically our row following. And if you look closely, at least for those of us who have spent a lot of time looking at this, these results look pretty good. And also looking at the vehicle flying, we're able to follow the rows fairly well, even into kind of these 5 meter per second winds, which of course is not a really windy day, but it definitely is good enough for most days, at least in Nebraska. In the mornings and evenings, we'll have winds that are less than this, and basically we were able to, through a lot of this data processing and filtering, we were able to follow the rows while also actively maintaining height control. So really, our goal and what we've achieved is really closing the loop, so that you don't need to use GPS. You can just rely on the laser scan data and tell it to follow a row. It'll follow a row, maintain the height, and that really reduces the kind of what the operator needs to do when flying this. So, and kind of future work on this. So we're working right now on analyzing. Unfortunately, we don't have a great ground truth system, so we're basically looking at videos we captured and analyzing how often it drifted off the row and whether it was able to return. And in the future, we definitely, I guess one of the key things is this year we were able to basically follow and measure rows. We want to basically extend this to being able to measure whole fields. So this is basically requiring precise switching between rows and knowing kind of where rows end in the field. And of course, there's a lot of other factors we definitely need to evaluate. So as the corn or perhaps other row crops, as they grow, we need to test how well our algorithms work under different growing conditions. Of course, wind is a key feature. Lighting as well. So fortunately, if you've worked with laser scanners before, they don't always work well outdoors. What we found is that in this downward-facing configuration, unless the sun is really right on the horizon and pointing into the scanner, we don't see problems with it being oversaturated. It tends to work well in these environments, but that's definitely another thing we need to consider. So, well, at this point, I want to talk a little bit about a couple other projects, but I don't know, does anybody have any questions before I move on? You can type them or speak them. Okay, so question is, what about crops where you can't really see the rows anymore, like fully grown sugar beets? That's a really good question. So we've really focused mainly on maize or corn here, and I think we could extract some information. We may not be able to know kind of the crop height, but as long as there's some taller part of the plant, and if they're planted in rows, we should be able to follow the rows. So you can think of this as kind of mounds of dirt. Okay, and so then another question is, what is the reaction of farmers using UAVs for phenotyping? So at least the kind of researchers who are the ones doing most of the phenotyping, they're really excited about this type of technology, and in part the things like just getting crop height is something that they never do, except very occasionally during the growing season for particular projects, and then at the end. But there are some of these works that show that this is actually an important characteristic, and if they can do it by pressing a button and spending an hour instead of 20 hours, I think at least the people here would like to use this on a weekly basis. That said, we're not sure about kind of these low flying vehicles for production. It's not clear that we can cover these huge farms fast enough for kind of these large scale grown systems. But there may be uses where from a high flying UAV you identify a potential problem area, and then you go down and use the other this type of sensor to zoom in. Okay, so another question. Let's see. In the case where the UAV drifts to the next row, how does it return to the initial row? Yeah, so this was actually one of the big challenges, and we'll be publishing some papers on this shortly that go into much more of the kind of mathematics and details. But one of the big challenges was this, basically if you get blown off a row, how do you get back? And it turns out in our control, we're fairly loose, so we allow ourselves to drift by, half a row or even a row. But what we're doing is basically maintaining an estimate of which row we're on. So we set our initial row, like, okay, you're over the row we want to follow, and we're able to detect that we drift off. So far, that's been fairly effective, even in places where like some of the rows are damaged and there are missing plants, is we're tracking a few rows with each scan. And I guess another question here is, are you planning to combine the laser scanner with other sensors in the future? So like RGB cameras. So right now we do have a camera that's just downward facing, and we're collecting all of that. We have some ideas of what we want to do with it, both from kind of the agronomy side and doing the analysis, but also looking at using it, implementing optical flow to further refine the row following. Now, the other thing that we're interested in is these more active sensors. So, basically sensors that the agronomists are using to, that can be mounted on tractors to measure the height, measure different canopy properties, but don't work well when they're far away. So these are some of the things we're looking at integrating as well. The collect, really high resolution data about these, especially about these phenotyping trials. So I guess there's another question on how fast can we fly and how long does it take to do a row. So right now, we typically fly in kind of the range of about 2 to 5 meters per second. So you can cover, a row fairly fast. Our flights can only, with this particular vehicle, we have about a 15, maybe 20-minute flight time. So definitely, and again, we've been doing kind of rows at a time, so I don't have off the top of my head kind of how long it would take to do a quarter section field or something, but we think, within a kind of an hour, you could do most of these kind of phenotyping type trials. But again, this is where, this type of technique, I think, if you put it on a fixed wing vehicle with a much longer life, and if you can figure out, how to do tight turns at the end, that might start to scale to kind of the large growing, or as I guess the group there pointed out, or using swarms of these, which is also something that's very interesting. So let me talk a little bit now about some other projects that we're working on, and this other one is basically on UAV water sampling. And again, so our goal here is actually to collect water samples with the UAV. And again, the challenges here, well, it's actually worse than flying over crops, because if something goes wrong, you fall in the water. So we're really working on, again, getting close into the environment, but not getting too close and being very robust. And one of the motivations, again, locally for this is actually an area in Nebraska where it's actually a recreation site where there are a bunch of these kind of man-made lakes, and this is the second most popular recreation site in the state, but it's also right next to the Platte River, which is an important source of water in the region. And what you see is a lot of little lakes, because they're manually dug out when they were kind of building some of the train tracks and railroads in the area for raw materials. But they're not connected together, and it turns out that there have been some toxic algal blooms that have killed dogs and things in the past. Now there's a lot of effort that goes into monitoring these lakes, and basically they have to go out and manually collect water samples, which typically entails putting a boat in each of these little lakes, and that ends up taking to do even half these lakes, so about 10 of these can take 12 to 14 hours, and most of that effort is involved in putting boats in and out of the water. So another example is during floods. So this is actually a picture from northeastern Nebraska where there were a lot of wildfires, and basically between these 2 days it rained, and you can see on the right hand one is really dirty from the ash runoff. And the water scientists we're working with here are interested in knowing, okay, what, right at this event, they want to get a snapshot of how this, propagates throughout the water system. They want to collect, hundreds of samples in many different locations very quickly so that they can kind of develop these snapshots. And, while this is showing, the ash runoff, of course, we're also interested in, how do the fertilizers and other chemicals we're applying to our fields, how do they enter the water systems and propagate through it? And, especially in cases like floods, where most of the water scientists, they may have equipment stationed there to automatically sense and collect samples, but during floods, they'll remove that to ensure that their sensors don't get washed away. So how is this done now? Well, largely, this is the method. So manually going out on a boat, getting a bucket of water and collecting little samples. They also, of course, put some sensors in the water to measure parameters, dissolved oxygen, pH, temperature, things like this, where there are compact, inexpensive sensors that they can measure it in the field. But a lot of the water analysis for especially, chemical and biological contaminants and features of the water, still has to be done at the lab. So they're still collecting a lot of water samples. Now, there are, of course, ways you can automate some of this. So there are these fixed samplers, but again, during things like floods, they take these out. There also are, my background is really robotics, and there are a lot of autonomous boats that can collect water samples and sense. But all of these also work well. If you're going to study Lake Michigan, you should definitely put a automated boat in. But for areas like in Nebraska, where we have a lot of little ponds, lots of places that are critical for agriculture and other applications, we can't afford to put a boat in every one of these. So with our kind of UAV, here's this Fremont Lake area again. The idea is that we can just drive into the parking lot in the middle of this area and launch the vehicle from there, and it can cover most of these lakes to effectively collect samples. But so what I'm gonna, and I guess some of their requirements, so they don't need a lot of water. So what we're gonna collect is just kind of these 20 milliliter samples. And of course, we also need to do some work to make sure that the method of collection, so collecting from the air, is not going to bias results. And again, similar to we're using totally kind of different set of sensors and approaches, but a lot of the conceptual challenges are similar in terms of how do you safely fly just a meter off of the water and avoid cross-contamination. We're also very concerned about things like wind and ensuring safety. So we use the same kind of base platform as in the crop height system, and let me, I guess, maybe start out by showing a video. And if hopefully this video, it runs smoothly, but there's also a YouTube link up at the corner there if you want to watch it separately or on your own. So this is actually a project that we're collaborating with some scientists at UC Berkeley. So this is one of their field reserve sites in California. And again, in this location, kind of in the foothills and not too far from Berkeley, they have a lot of these ponds. And here you can see basically we fly down and dip the pump in the water, and then we have these 3 little vials that we can fill with water. And this is fully autonomous. So we're kind of programming, in this case, a GPS location where we want to go, and then we automatically go down to collect the samples. Now, one of the things, if you have not done any work before, and this is also important for the crop work, is that the onboard altimeters are basically this pressure sensor. They measure air pressure, and they don't work very well for maintaining altitude. So they're fine if you're flying relatively high, but over the course of just a few minutes, they can drift by a meter or more. So when we're flying really close, we can't rely just on those sensors. So we have to add other sensors. Now, just to talk about kind of some of the physical system a little more. So at the bottom of that tube you saw going down, we have a very tiny pump that we use to pump water up into the sample chambers. So we have 3 of these that are 20 milliliter vials that we can just easily remove. In between, we have a servo that is able to direct the flow of water into any one of those chambers. And importantly, we actually have an intermediate stage where we can flush out the tubing. So whenever we go to a new location, we're actually going to flush water out for a while to clean out everything so that we're minimizing any chances of kind of cross-contamination. And they're easy to remove so that you can collect these three samples, fly back, switch the vial, and switch the batteries, and be ready to go again. Now, the way we maintain height is we've actually added a pair of these ultrasonic rangefinders that give us some redundant height information. Also, along the tube, we have basically exposed wires that we use as conductivity sensors so that we can actually tell how deep the tube is in the water. And I won't go into the details, but basically we're fusing all of this information together to get a very accurate height estimate. And we've done a fair amount of experimental validation. So we've basically looked at how well we can collect samples, also comparing them to manual methods. So can we actually do the samples we collect match those of manual ones? And it turns out that we do fairly well. So there are some things that change, like the temperature of the sample may change just during transit time. Also things, actually surprisingly, we did an experiment where we measured dissolved oxygen both at the source of collection and also back at shore after we collected it. And it turned out that actually stayed the same. So we're not really storing up these samples too much to change the gases in them. And then one of the key things is, of course, operation in the wind. And so we're able to effectively sample even in kind of these 5 meter per second winds, which out on the water with the vehicle flying out there, it's, that's more than we thought we would want to do. But this figure shows basically how different altitudes above the water impact the sampling success rate. And you can see that when we're just 0.72 meters above the water, we get kind of good success rate throughout. Now, that is a little closer than we would like to be. I mean, that doesn't feel comfortable as kind of a backup pilot who's may attempt to take over if something goes wrong. But even up to this 0.92 meters, we can fairly effectively sample in different wind conditions. We've also done some work. So this is some recent work showing data sets we collected where instead of just collecting samples from the surface, what we actually did is we had a temperature sensor and we adjusted the depth of that sensor. So by changing the altitude of the vehicle from 0 meters to 2.5 meters, so that we could actually basically get these full kind of transects of the water. And so this figure shows kind of data from an area where we collected 6 of these kind of depth transects, and we actually did comparisons of this compared to static arrays to look at how both the vehicle flying over the water may stir up the water or otherwise impact it. And it turns out that it didn't seem to impact the mixing of the water, and certainly not deeper down. So this again is a way that we can basically quickly measure lakes and determine really their 3D structure much better, which again is something that's very time consuming and difficult for scientists to do right now, and is therefore something that they really don't do very often. Now, I can show you, this is another video showing flight, and this is actually an application where instead of collecting water samples, what they're looking for here is actually the veligers of zebra mussels, which is an invasive species, and the veligers are the little babies. And Nebraska is actually, we've been fortunate until recently, we didn't have these in many lakes, but now they're starting to be discovered. And this is the kind of existing sampling technique where from shore, you're having to throw in these nets. It can be difficult, dangerous, hard to access. You definitely don't want to put boats in this case, because you can, then if a lake is contaminated, and you'll be spreading this around to other lakes you go to. So in this case, what we were able to do is basically instead of collecting samples of water, we pumped water through a filter. So we could basically collect, similar to the kind of the tow that the scientist was doing, we can collect measure the number of veligers in the sample there. So, overall, we've collected hundreds, probably it's now in the thousands of samples, both outdoors and we have an indoor test bed as well. And it is stable in these kind of 5 meter per second winds. And the And we've done some pretty good analysis to show that, these are comparable to kind of the manual samples scientists normally take. And we're also, some of the uses we're looking at, so this kind of temperature mapping is invasive species. We're also interested in looking at, there's some eDNA techniques where we can actually analyze the DNA in samples of water. Also, we are working on, integrating other types of sensors to do in situ measurements beyond kind of just the temperature, so that you can do more adaptive sampling strategies where you actually will only sample when you've detected some other trigger, like maybe a oxygen, which may indicate that there may be some toxic algal blooms in the area. You could then choose to pull there. So, so this is what I want to talk about: water sampling. And out all of these, I think, especially when you're flying, failures are a part of field robotics. And so I want to talk a little bit now about some of the things we're doing to try to improve the overall safety of these systems. And for those of you who may not know, this is actually a picture of this DJI drone that was crashed on the White House grounds. And we, of course, have had our share of failures. So this is a video showing where we had a failure of a motor to start when we were taking off. And of course, when we're right by the water, bad things happen. We were able to actually fully recover this vehicle. Fortunately, for kind of FAA reasons, we were operating with a tether at this location, so we were able to pull it out. And after many hours of disassembly and drying, it worked again. But there are a lot of failures that happen in field robotics, and I would say that there are maybe 4 classes of failures. So some are purely hardware, things break, sensors break. I think some of the other challenges, of course, as I've been talking about, kind of the environmental challenges. And I think one of the big challenges with the environment is that, we are also guilty of this. We develop our systems in kind of an indoor test bed, and we do things like blow fans at them. But when we go out in the field, things are just different. And as a programmer, we aren't always able to, figure out how things are going to be different outdoors. We try, but we fail. And so this is the cause of failures. Also, users are just certainly, we've all crashed vehicles because we've inputted the wrong command. And then there are the more traditional, bugs in the software that can cause problems. So one project that we've also been working on is basically a method to overall kind of automate the kind of detection of errors and how to improve them. And so in this case, we did this indoors with a vehicle moving around and trying to land on this moving platform. Well, that does really well when the vehicle is just moving nicely. And what we did is we looked at, and we used ROS, this robot operating system, and we analyzed a lot of data that's being generated from this and passing through the system. What we're able to do is infer these invariants, so what it should look like when it operates correctly. Because in this case, we added a fan on the left-hand side there, and most of the time our system that worked well crashed. But what we could do is basically, from automatically analyzing and learning from these successes and failures, we could generate this monitor that could detect when things were proper. So in this case, we broke the platform, and it crashes without our monitor, but with the monitor, it's able to detect that something is wrong, so it should actually abort the landing and take off again. And so this was kind of this general technique that we can apply to any kind of these ROS systems, these robot operating systems. And in these cases where we kind of changed the environment or broke things, we went from only about 20% success to almost 90% success. So this is one of the techniques we've been developing, and I don't have much time, so let me just kind of skip to the kind of end here. But basically, we're able to detect when there are these violations, when something anomalous went wrong. and then take a corrective action. So I think this is a very powerful technique, and it's one that we're working on extending and also integrating into all of our other field systems to detect these types of failures and faults. So let me just quickly talk about one kind of last project that we're doing in the lab that I think is possibly of interest to this community. We're also working on actually wireless power transfer, where the goal is basically if we have sensors deployed in remote locations, so you have sensors, on your, in this case, a center pivot system or buried underground or along a bridge, what we really want to do is fly out with the UAV, collect the data from the sensors, of course, but also while we're there, we want to recharge the batteries. And the way we're doing this is actually through a wireless power transfer system. So this video shows basically at the top there a light that's being basically that's representing our sensor, where the UAV is actually powering that. So that doesn't have any batteries or anything. Basically, when the UAV gets close enough, it's going to wirelessly transfer power, similar to like how you might have an electric toothbrush charge, but longer range and more energy. So that while we're collecting the data, we can also charge the sensors. And what we think this will, really enable much longer term sensor deployments where you can actually, embed them in structures, bury them underground, and you won't have to have a big solar panel, in the middle of your field that just doesn't work in agriculture typically. But you can actually charge the sensors wirelessly with this type of approach. So we've done a number of small deployments and experiments with this. We can transfer kind of the 10 watts, which is, just to give you an idea, in the kind of the flight time of the UAV, we're able to charge a sensor that, like a AAA battery type of energy transfer. And, that's, good enough for most of these low power remote sensors to operate for, months or even longer. So I guess the takeaway maybe from today, I hope, is that hopefully I've convinced you a little bit that UAVs are really promising for agriculture, and they can do more than just these high flying flights. Well, I mean, that's certainly what's hot now and what people are really starting to use them for in agriculture. I think they really have a disruptive potential when you start to bring them even closer into the environment. And of course, ground robots working in the field, I think there's a lot of opportunities for synergy and collaboration between vehicles flying above the canopy and those kind of traversing under it at all stages of growth. Now, of course, there's a lot of challenges beyond kind of the technical challenges that I talked about today. So certainly public perception. So, privacy is a big concern for people with drones. I think this is something that in agriculture, if you're having the grower as the one who's actually flying these, and maybe you're flying with sensors other than cameras, I think there's a way that you can alleviate that. But this is definitely something that as a community, as we're kind of developing these types of drones and other flying vehicles, I think it's important to be aware of and try to be proactive in how we interact with the communities. Also, in the United States, and now, increasingly elsewhere, there are uncertain but changing regulations, which are hard to predict, but that's something that we have to be aware of, and is definitely a challenge. My group here, we have all my students and myself, we've gone through all the FAA ground school and all the processes to get waivers to fly legally outdoors. So these are definitely challenges. And then, of course, there are still a lot of these fundamental challenges in robotics that we need to address to get really close into the environment. And this is just a picture of some of my students, and I have a number of grad students and undergrads, and I co-direct the lab with another faculty member. So with that, I would be happy to answer some more questions. And if you have questions, you can also certainly email me offline, and I'm happy to answer. Okay, so there's a question about which programming languages, tools, libraries to use, what processing units. Yeah, so primarily we're using ROS, so Robot Operating System, as the way we're controlling the vehicle. Now the UAVs we're buying these off the shelf from, most of the ones we use are from Ascending Technologies, which is a German company. And so we're not controlling kind of or changing the low-level flight controllers, but what we are doing is doing kind of the higher level controls, changing, adding sensors, fusing that with existing data. Mostly, so ROS, the easiest thing to program in is C++ or Python. So we use both, and I think one of the good things about ROS is that it really has a lot of these libraries built in for, doing, data fusion and extracting laser scans and things like that. And I guess in terms of processing units, we have a couple of different modes of operation. So when we're doing development, a lot of what we do is we're actually remotely controlling the vehicle over a Zigbee radio link, than with a laptop ground station. And this just makes it easier to be, adjusting parameters and changing, our algorithms and approaches. But like the crop surveying, we've fully integrated that. We are currently using an Odroid computer. It's like a kind of like a beefed up Raspberry Pi. So it can easily run ROS. It's able to do all of the laser scan processing and so forth, and collecting camera data as well.
Carrick, this is a great talk. It's kind of like we got two talks for the price of one. Not only the area of phenotyping, but also the part about the water sample collection. It's very interesting.
Yes.
So thank you very much for that. I'm gonna ask people if there are any questions. We've already had a very intensive discussion.
Well,
I guess if not,
that's been great.
Carrick, I want to go ahead, please.
Yeah, and as I said, if anybody thinks of any other questions, feel free to send me. I guess the link to our website is up at the top of the there. You can find my address there. It's been a great set of questions, and yeah, I hope to see many of you in person soon too.
And if I may, I'd like to congratulate you for breaking the records. We've reached 40 participants today, and that was the top most attended webinar of all the 32 we had so far. So thank you very much. It's a great topic. It's drawing a lot of interest. We're going to continue bringing speakers in this topic in the future. With that, let me thank everybody for participating, and we'll see everybody in about a month. Thank you.
Thank you.